Something I've noticed about this particular community is that it's precisely that. It's a community, and there's a real sense of family. Someone actually mentioned that to me this past weekend, just kind of in passing, and it was framed in terms of a compliment, and it was something I thought about the whole day and continuing on to today. This really distinct sense of family and community, and it's a really powerful thing. It's what every parish should aspire to. And you see it in various contexts, right? So funerals, just how people step up, not just at the visitation, but obviously at the Mass. And, I share your joys, I share your sorrows, But also in Theology on Tap, actually. So, and both Ashley and I really noticed a huge shift when we changed it to Phoebes locally in Tottenham. Because there's something about that pub where people see it as their own. And with each passing Theology on Tap, we're preparing less and less, actually. And when it came to the last Theology on Tap, I don't think we even talked about it at all. We just kind of showed up and hoped for the best, And I think a big part of it was there was this real sense of comfort, right? We're just hanging out. I don't know if you remember this. There was this actor named Charles Grodin. He had this show called the Charles Grodin Show, and he had on as a guest David Letterman. And partway through the interview, he was saying to Dave Letterman, "Wow, I'm really enjoying this interview." And Dave Letterman was like, "Well, the reason why is because I feel like the interview hasn't even really started. I just feel like we're just kind of hanging out, And along the same lines for Theology on Tap, it wasn't this past one, but the month before that. Someone said to me, Father, I feel like if there was another priest here in terms of this assignment, you wouldn't be as honest with us as you are right now because there's another priest. And I remember thinking, I don't know how you know that, but that's absolutely true. Right? So that's a long way of saying that I'm already having a good time. I hope you're having a good time too. Because with ministry, it's one of those things, right? God is in the preparation, but he's also in the giving of the thing, right? So I've read the relevant Gospels. I've obviously thought about the thing and prayed about it and whatever. But again, God is in the giving of the thing too. You can't overlook the fact that ultimately ministry is incarnational. You do the prep work, you do the reading, and you do the praying and whatnot, but then you arrive at the moment and we mutually discover the thing that God wants to give to us. And that's the hope and the expectation with every moment of ministry, but it really helps when you like the people involved, right? So obviously the mission is all about St. Peter. And just to let you into my thought process with regards to that, I always want to make sure the gospel dictates the format as opposed to the other way around, because there's a way to do a retreat or a mission or wherever where you kind of make particular arguments or make a particular proposal and you pick certain biblical examples to support your point, but then you might be on track, you might not be, right? So if you do it in the reverse, what does the gospel say, and you allow yourself to be shaped by the thing, it's usually pretty safe. So when you think about all the relevant stories, just as a general point in the back of your mind, very much in Technicolor. A lot of detail, a lot of not just speaking, but characters moving around in relation to each other. And that's no accident, right? Because Peter, of course, is the primary witness and leader of the church. So it's very important that we become familiar with his story and all the kind of lessons contained therein, right? So in terms of the format, as you know, 3 consecutive nights. So Mass beginning at 7 p.m. with adoration, super long homily, right? So God bless you in terms of the bathroom breaks. And each night kind of a different thing, right? So roughly the way it goes, the first night is all about kind of Peter in ordinary time. I think the second night, not that I've written it, I think it's going to be more about Peter in and around Holy Week. And then the third night, kind of post-resurrection accounts, right? So I think we'll roughly kind of do it like that. But anyways, tonight, just a couple of stories to hit upon, right? So first of all, the calling of St. Peter. Different versions of that particular story you find in the Gospel. Well, I want to focus on the one that you find in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 5, because that's the most relevant and practical for our purposes today, right? So, as you know, St. Peter is a fisherman, right? And so the story begins with him washing his nets. The idea is that I'm not just ready to go home, I'm really ready to go home. In the aftermath of my failure, that's important to know, right? So you discover later on in the story, he's fished all night and he's caught nothing. Just to go back to things we talked about before, right? This whole dynamic of hurt people hurt people. Hurt people hurt people. It's not necessarily that people have a total absence of goodwill, they've been hurt too. I always think about something my spiritual director said to me a long time ago, people aren't the way that they are because they're necessarily evil and wicked. People are the way that they are because of Adam and Eve. We're all laboring under the after effects of original sin, right? So hurt people, and whenever you or I have been not loved in the way we should have been loved by the people who should have loved us, a certain woundedness obtains. Now, you don't want to reduce it to like this particular wound or that particular wound. We're hurt in all sorts of different ways. We're not loved in the way we should have been loved by the people who should have loved us. But one of the primordial wounds is this wound of shame. Shame as opposed to guilt, right? So guilt is like, I've done something wrong. Okay, yeah, I feel guilty with regards to that. Hopefully that's followed by forgiveness and reconciliation and reparation and all those things. But shame is like, I suck, right? So it goes to identity. I'm terrible, I'm no good, I'm not lovable. The particular thing is like, I haven't been loved in the way I should have been loved by the people who should have loved me. Therefore, it penetrates my heart and my sense of my identity. Therefore, I'm not lovable. Shame, right? Now, the thing I want you to notice in the early going is that shame runs in parallel tracks with pride. It's kind of interesting how that works, right? So Dr. Bob Schutz and Jay Kim talk about this in terms of the Restore the Glory podcast, which I'll cite throughout the course of the mission. So basically, when you think about shame is like a wound, right? So a wound which obtains in the aftermath of not being loved in the way I should have been loved. But pride is the sin. And the sin of pride arises when I don't deal with my shame in humility before the Lord. And so I try to grasp for a false form of love. I start grasping for a false form of love, right? So fundamentally speaking, I believe I'm not good. It's the whole thing we talked about before, right? False core beliefs, right? If people really knew me, they would reject me. And if people really knew me, that, they would discover I'm not worthy of love, right? So shame up and down the board is infinitely relatable, right? And again, more to the point, the way we tend to deal with that is through the deadly sin of pride, right? Aspiring for that which we don't really want, actually. So what's pride? It's like I aspire for affirmation as it pertains to my strengths and my gifts and my talents. Sort of a performance orientation, right? It's almost kind of gross. Well, it is kind of gross if you break it down, right? It's admiration, that's kind of a nice way to put it, but contractual is a gross way to put it, right? So you stay with me. I implicitly beg you to stay with me by putting before you my gifts, my talents, my strengths, my beauty, and all these different things, right? Like, please don't leave me, right? That's acting on the space of shame/pride. And that happens all the time. And this is the situation with St. Peter. So I self-identify as a fisherman. So performance orientation, which is made worse by the fact that he's a guy, right? So guys do this all the time. My value is tied to my performance, my ability to produce that which the world finds to be important and valuable. I'm a fisherman, more fish, more men. So here's this thing, I fished all night, I caught nothing. And so the story begins, I'm heavily steeped in shame. And I tried to deal with it by way of pride, performance orientation, but I fished all night and caught nothing. And so here's this aspiration for false love, but as always, it becomes dust in my mouth, right? And that's the situation. This is the moment where people turn to all these false substitutes for the reality of God, but even on a more base level, just like coping with one's pain. I go drinking, I go to way of drugs, I go shopping, I look at porn. And again, that's like just the very opening line of the story. And Jesus Christ shows up. Now what happens, again, it's all about the details, right? So he gets into Peter's boat without permission. The setting is that, again, it's the Gospel of Luke chapter 5, right? So even though it's pretty early, pretty famous. People, they've heard about the Lord, no one has spoken like this guy, no one has done miracles like this guy. They all kind of leave everything, their places of safety, their towns and whatever, to follow this guy, to listen to him, to linger in his presence, to listen to his word, right? And so they're crushing in upon him to hear the word of God, right? To be in his presence. There's a practical aspect of Jesus getting into Peter's boat. So if I get in the boat, I push away from the shore, better sight lines, right? They can see me better, and I can see them better. It's easier to preach and minister and that sort of thing. But if you break it down and read between the lines, I have come, Peter, for you. Shades of like the woman at the well. I've come just for you. And this whole thing with the crowds and the fish and whatever, this is all for your particular benefit. But you don't know it yet. You don't know it yet, right? So again, he begins the story from a place of shame, failed recourse to pride. Jesus gets in his boat. It's kind of funny, I'll raise a story with like the kids in the schools. It's like, okay, so when Jesus gets in Peter's boat, what do you think Peter's reaction is? Everyone's like, oh, he feels honored. Thank you for coming in my boat. It's like, how about drop dead? Get out of my boat. I want to go home and I want to drink or whatever the case may be, right? Now, here's what's interesting. This came up actually during our last Theology on Tap. We know that every movement of grace is like God's initiative, right? God always is the author of conversion. But then there's always that thing of like, yeah, but we're called to cooperate. We are, but you'd be surprised how it plays out in the gospel, right? So here's the Lord. He takes the initiative. I get in your boat without permission. I know you're mad. I know you're upset, right? And you want to tell me to drop dead and get out of your boat. But he doesn't. Why? Not because he has deep respect for the rabbi. It's because the people are watching. If I tell this guy to get lost, who they admire so deeply, I'm going to look like a jerk. And I don't want to look like a jerk. So it's like, oh, fine, Rabbi, you can use my boat. So it's pride. And God uses that. Jesus Christ uses his residual pride to accomplish his salvific designs. A really important detail, right? So cooperation, it's not feeling that great. It's not feeling particularly like I want to go God's way, and but God can use that. I would really like to kick you out of my boat, but for the fact I feel the shame and pride in front of the crowd, so fine, you can get in my boat, and that's enough. Okay, so Jesus gets in the boat. He's with Peter. Now, again, it's like the gospel doesn't really say these things. You got to read into it. Does he give a short sermon? Does he give a long sermon? I always remember bringing this up with the schools, and the kids will say, he gives a long sermon. Why? Because he's Jesus. It's like, what? I think he gives a long sermon because he wants to give people their money's worth. It's like people like buying a ticket to a concert and they come from far and wide and like Taylor Swift sings like one song and you're like, what? You know? So he wants to give them their money's worth and he wants to help them because they're harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd, right? So long sermon. So have you ever been through a long sermon before? Right? Before I wanted to kill myself, now I want to kill you, right? So here's a situation, right? I'm sitting through this long sermon, now I really want to go home. And Jesus is like, hey, let's go fishing. Right? Now, before I hated your guts, now I really want you to drop dead, right? But I don't tell you to leave because of the crowd. So pride, again, working in service of this thing, right? Now, you know what happens, right? So he catches a lot of fish. It's like, bursting at the seams in terms of the nets. And like they drag at the shore. They need other people to help, right? And then Peter falls to his knees. Depart from me, Lord, for I'm a sinful man. And don't worry, don't be afraid. From now on, you'll be fishers of men. Now, again, all about the details, right? So it's kind of an interesting thing that he's a fisherman, and so at the beginning, if he would have caught like that amount of fish, minus like the Lord and minus the crowd, it would have been like good day. And now in this story, he walks away from his thing. It's not like whatever, substitute fish with something else. It's his thing. I'm a fisherman. And here's more of my thing that I've ever seen in my entire life, and I'm able to walk away from it. And the question is, how do you arrive at that point? It's a really important detail. It wasn't the result of an intellectual exercise. It's not like he picked up a book and went to chapter 6 about detachment. I was like, oh gosh, I should detach myself from the things of this world and follow the Lord. It wasn't that, right? So what it was, like basically he just journeyed with the Lord through the messiness of life, and somehow at the end, different. So the example that comes to mind is a really good friend of mine. It took me a while to realize how amazing he is, right? And all of a sudden, it's just like, this guy's incredible. And I had to ask him, like, what, basically, just to sum it up, how did you become amazing? Tell me, right? And he's like, well, basically, I discovered that life is not about you. Before, I used to heavily immerse myself into things of this world and stuff, and I was like angry and whatever. And all of a sudden, I was put in a situation where I had to care for my grandfather who was like basically losing his memory and dying. And that changed me, and I realized that life is not about you, it's about giving yourself to other people, and you find yourself through the giving of oneself in love. And I was like, what? Right? I know we preach it all the time, but it's weird hearing it from you as opposed to me. So there was that, right? Now, here's the thing about that. As he tells a story, it's just like, there were moments, where it's just like, I don't like this. And I'm angry, and I'm mad. And I'm even having arguments with my grandfather, right? And do I like showering him? Do I like changing his diapers? And like, no. So there are moments where I'm angry and I'm rebelling in my heart, but like he's in it. And so basically here's a situation where he's forced to give of himself habitually every single day over a period of like months and maybe even longer in service of another. And basically the Lord changes his heart against his will. And that's how it happens. So it's not a matter of like making these intellectual connections or being smart or clever or even feeling a certain way. That's why we always go back to this thing like, okay, but I don't get it, or I'm feeling this, or I'm feeling unpleasant feelings and thoughts. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Just hang in there, go through life with the Lord. You might not know what he's about, what he's doing, but it's okay. He's slowly doing his thing, even though it's painful, even though you don't understand. One more detail with regards to that story. So, depart from me, Lord, from a sinful man. So, the exposition of his shame. So, I'm in the presence of like sheer holiness, right? And so, I can't take it. I can't take it. So, depart from me, Lord, from a sinful man. So, it was hinted at the beginning of the story, but now it's in like full color, right? But what's interesting is that the Lord doesn't address it at that point. He will, but big picture, long game. So one day, we will deal with this particular thing, but not right now, because you're not ready. Okay, now you hold that thought, and let's move to a different story. So Gospel of Matthew chapter 8, right? So the healing of St. Peter's mother-in-law. So this is a situation where basically Jesus is doing that thing that he does, and he's teaching and healing and doing all sorts of miracles and whatnot. And people are like, this is amazing. We should keep this up. We should keep this guy forever, right? And then Jesus does that other thing that he does, right? So he does his ministry very intensely, but then he goes to the mountaintop to behold his Father in heaven, to strengthen himself with regards to that which is to come, clarity of purpose and intention, right? So he does that habitually, oscillating back and forth between those two things. St. Peter, on behalf of all the disciples, on behalf of all the people who are cured and healed in that town, he goes looking for him, he finds him. Look, everyone's been looking for you. And the invitation is, come back and do more of that stuff. That was great. The healing of the sick and whatnot, that was great. Just keep it up. Maybe you stay here forever. People really appreciate that. Now, we've talked this before, right? This thing called the tyranny of the should. The tyranny of the should. And the idea here is that, okay, Lord, here's this thing where there's an opportunity to do something good. You have the ability, and what's more, no one can do this thing as well as you can. So it would seem to be evident. You should do this thing. And the Lord says, no. We're going to go to the other town because that's the reason why I was sent. And he just goes, right? Now, this is why it's advantageous to have a Lenten Mission. I can expound upon this thing in a way that perhaps I couldn't during the weekend homily, right? A lot of people will look at the story and they'll say, well, the takeaway message is you got to have balance in your life, So there's time to work, time to rest, time to apply yourself, and time to pray and whatever. The Lord will never waste a gospel story to simply say you should take your day off, right? Everything that the Lord has in terms of the gospel text, it goes to identity and purpose and meaning of life, right? So I remember listening to this episode from this podcast called Catholic Answers Focus. I think it was called God Wants You to Rest. And the speaker was Dr. Michael Naughton, I believe. And basically he said, a lot of times people, they live and die trying to search for, balance, So vacations at the appropriate time, days off at the appropriate time. But what's lacking is a sense of integrity, a sense of connectedness. So with regards to this thing, the Lord's not articulating or prioritizing balance. He's highlighting the importance of identity. So Dr. Bob Schutz and Jay Kim talk about this too, right? So in terms of where I get my sense of identity, we'll revisit this when it comes to the story of Caesarea Philippi for tomorrow, I think. But basically, you got to recognize, where do I tend to find my sense of identity? So clearly as a starting point, there's a lot of people who just couldn't care less about us. And so if you try to get your sense of identity from them, not good. But what we tend to do is we look at our friends, or we look at our family members, right? And implicitly, we derive our sense of value and self-worth and identity from them. But the thing is, hurt people hurt people. Again, not an overt absence of goodwill. It's not like people are trying to hurt you. It's just everyone's wounded, so everyone has a filter. So I give an example, right? So let's say there's a little kid, and they're living with their parents, right? And the parent is doing and saying things in relation to the young kid. The kid doesn't realize that, okay, what they're saying and doing is perhaps affected by the fact that they're having a bad day, or they're tired, or they feel anxious and scared. They take everything at face value. And so maybe as a little boy or a little girl, I present this particular idea as unpolished thought and fear and trembling, but if it's not received in the way I expect, oh my gosh, what does that mean? That sort of thing happens all the time, and it graduates to adulthood, right? And the idea is that, okay, identity must be grounded in clarity about who God is and who I am in the eyes of the Lord. But again, we'll revisit that kind of later on. The other thing I want to highlight with regards to this story, it kind of ties back to the calling of St. Peter. So you'll notice issues of timing. So even though it sounds weird, the Lord is not afraid to let people live in tension. The Lord is not afraid to allow people to stay in the space of pain or in the process of becoming while he goes to the next town. It's not because he doesn't care, it's because I trust in the timing of my Father in heaven. You want to make sure you get that right? So a lot of times we absolve ourselves in terms of haste or forcing the issue because I have good intentions, right? But in order for an action to be good, it's not just like my intended object, like it has to be everything, timing in accordance with God's will. Otherwise, it's the calling of St. Peter. I'm fishing all night, I'm catching nothing. It's only when you do things in obedience to the will of the Father, that's the thing that's fruitful. Otherwise, you're just throwing darts at a board, right? So timing. I'll give you an example. I remember reading this book about psychological wounds, and I was like pretty deep into it, and I was just stirring up all sorts of ugliness in my heart, and I was feeling bad and shame and all these things. And I brought it to my director. I was just like, yeah, I was reading this book, and I just feel awful, but I'm trying to do right by the Lord and grow in holiness and stuff. And he was like, why are you reading that book? So basically don't, just like throw it in the garbage. And I did, and I never read it ever again. And I feel so much better, And it's also a point, because we look at that, it's like, okay, well, that's irresponsible, but no, like when it comes to like the human heart, it's like digging in your backyard, You want to dig where the Lord wants you to dig, as deep as he wants you to dig. So don't fool yourself into thinking like, okay, I'll just go the way of haste and start digging everywhere in my wounded heart without looking at the Lord and just hope for the best. It's a recipe for disaster. So that's really kind of important to know. This is something I need to constantly remind myself with regards to spiritual direction, right? So I see a lot of people for spiritual direction and sometimes referrals and whatnot. And usually spiritual direction is like once a month. So people will come in and whatever. And sometimes, I'll make this mistake where it's just like, hey, it seems to be going well. We should meet more often. But I always got to go back to my internship pastor. He said, you always got to remember that what brings about the transformation is God's grace. And so it's not really about like the chat or saying wise and clever things in a moment of spiritual direction. Like, it's about this person and how they respond to God's grace. And it's always God's initiative. And the reason why spiritual direction works, even when you see the person like simply once a month, is because God can do things beyond you. He doesn't need you, actually, right? So you have a small role to play in terms of saying this particular thing in this particular moment in space and time, but it's always been God's grace. And when you forget that, that's when you go the way of haste and kind of, in a certain sense, ruining what God is trying to do. So there's that. Now, the third and final story I want to focus on for today, basically it's Jesus walking on the water, right? So it's from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 14, I believe, right? So there's two stories in the Gospel where Jesus sends the disciples in the midst of storms. So it's no small detail that Jesus sends the disciples in the midst of storms twice as opposed to once, right? And it tells us that storms are part of the deal. So the first story, which I won't cover, it's this idea of Jesus being asleep in the boat, right? So there's that. This is the one where, again, Jesus is walking on the water. And again, it's all about context and timing. So, again, he sends them intentionally into the midst of the storm. Right away, that should tell us something. How many times are we in a situation where it's like difficult, challenging, like the storm? We're like, Lord, when are you going to take away the storm? Whereas if you realize, like, no, this is permitted in God's providential designs, then there has to be a point to it. Heather Kim talks about this, right? She says, a lot of times we kind of carry our cross in circles. We kind of forget the cross is meant to lead to, like, something, the resurrection, new life. So something in me has to die to receive that which is new, which conduces to my benefit. But we tend to forget that, We just, okay, Lord, I'm in this difficult situation, and like, I guess I'm just called to suffer. It's like, well, maybe you're called to change in response to the storm. Maybe there's that, Now, in terms of like the water and the storm, different ways to look at it, right? So sometimes you look at it in terms of like chaos. But one interesting thing I've heard is that the water, and the storms in particular, They represent life interpreted through my woundedness. My life interpreted through my woundedness. So the filter, I haven't been loved in a way I should have been loved by people who should have loved me, and so whenever there's suffering, whenever there's a storm, I interpret it in terms of my abandonment wounds, for example. Here's yet another example where the Lord has abandoned me, where he doesn't love me, as opposed to, no, like he loves me, and precious in the eyes of the Lord is death of his faithful, and so if he permits even a paper cut, never mind like a storm, it's for our benefit, right? So there's that. Now, again, timing and context. In terms of like when the Lord comes, there's this thing about the furlongs and the watch of the night, so it's a biblical thing, but don't worry, we're together. So 25 to 30 furlongs, basically it works out to like 3 to 5 miles. So they've been rolling for a long time. Now, the watches of the night, there's 4 of them, right? So 6 to 9, 9 to midnight, midnight to 3, 3 to 6. And Jesus comes at the 4th watch of the night. So they've been rolling for like 3 to 5 miles, and he comes between 3 and 6 in the morning. And the idea is that we're not just tired, but any illusion we had in terms of false modes of security, that's gone. And that's the point of it. Now, I want to kind of pause on that a little bit, because if you think about it, a lot of times we kind of cop out when it comes to the first watch of the night. It's kind of interesting. I notice this a lot in parish life, not just here. I always got to qualify it by saying that. But a lot of times people will go through parish life and like, oh my gosh, here's a difficult person, here's a difficult circumstance, right? And a lot of times it's exposed pretty early, like what your thing is, you know? Like, oh gosh, I never trusted in the Lord at all. I always trusted in my own strength. And that was revealed not in the 4th watch of the night, but like the first half of the 1st watch of the night. And the idea is to be alerted to that. And so, okay, here's an opportunity for growth and conversion. Now, the Lord emerges from the heart of the storm. So here's this thing which I'm inclined to fear the most. And from the heart of the thing comes this person, which I don't immediately recognize to be the Lord. So they're terrified. They think it's a ghost, right? And of course, the Lord says, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Now, here's what's interesting. Peter, he's like, "Lord, if it's you, command me to walk on the water." And I don't know about you, but the first couple times when I saw that, I'm like, that's weird. And I remember talking to my spiritual director about this, and I said, why did Peter do that? And he goes, well, it's a moment of discernment. I'm like, yeah, but he says, if it's you, let me walk on the water. Why does he do that? He's like, well, because it's a mode of discernment. And I said it again, and he said, it's a mode of discernment. Then I realized it was a moment of discernment. So it's one of these things, right? So when I'm in this storm, it's a moment of discernment. So am I called to do something to make the thing pass? Or is it something I'm meant to lean into? So I think I've used this example before. There was a seminarian friend of mine. He was praying because someone was dying. I think it was his nephew or his niece. And then he prayed as you might expect, like, Lord, I pray that this person might be healed. Pray for healing, pray for healing, pray for healing. But the underlying thing is, not my will, but your will be done. So shades of the Garden of Gethsemane. And what he discerned over time was that, no, this person is going to die. So then he changed his prayer. So now instead of a prayer of healing, I have a prayer of acceptance and strength and fortitude in this moment of difficulty. So I lean into this thing as opposed to changing it. I think a similar thing here. Lord, if it is you, command me to walk on the water. It is I. Do not be afraid. Come. And he walks on the water into the heart of a storm. It's just crazy. You see why this guy's picked as the first pope, right? So he's walking a bit, and then that whole thing, like, you know, principle, like eyes on the Lord, eyes off you, eyes on the Lord, eyes off the storm. He walks for a bit, but then he notices the winds and the waves, and he sinks, and Lord, save me. Lord immediately grasps his hand. You know, ye of little faith, why did you doubt? They go in the boat, and immediately the storm is calmed. And people are like, truly, this was the Son of God. Now, maybe you've heard me say this before, and if you have, just pretend you haven't heard it before, right? But this is one of those situations where, like, I always think about the other disciples. And again, you don't really hear it in terms of, like, what they're thinking, what they're saying and stuff, right? But, like, you see Peter, he's walking on the water, and all of a sudden he sinks, and he's rebuked by the Lord, right? Which is a common thing. Depart from me, Lord, for I'm a sinful man. Get behind me, Satan, all these things, right? So what are those guys thinking? Probably thinking, boy, what a loser. I'm so glad I stayed in the boat, right? But then here's this thing, right? Like the Lord looks to the heart while people look to the outward appearance. So again, it's these small acts of obedience and faithfulness. So yeah, he sunk, but like he was walking on the water. In the moment, it's like, Lord, if it's you, I'm going to walk into the heart of the storm. And I'm going to do this thing I've never seen anyone but you do, walk in the water, even though I know it's a pretty good chance I might sink because I tend to look at my life through my woundedness. And the Lord's like, yeah, that's enough for now.